Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? Good, splendid. It's Friday. It's Cinco de Mayo. I assume nobody has started drinking yet, but you know, we will give you a free pass as soon as we finish this event. Okay? My favorite tweet of the morning was somebody who tweeted out, "If you shouted 'build the wall,' you're not allowed to drink today." And I think that would be a very good rule to actually bring in. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. It's a distinct pleasure and honor for us to have a very distinguished panel here today, obviously centered around Senator Armando Rios Piter, who is directly here to my left. But let me just say that this is an event co-organized with the Atlantic Council, with whom we work very, very closely on a number of events. And the great thing is that Jason, Marczak, and myself, we're not just colleagues, but we're also neighbors. We both live in the People's Republic of Petworth, and we frequent the same establishments, shall we say.
Yeah, we'll have our own flag for Petworth pretty soon.
Exactly, exactly. Yes, and there will be no wall around the Republic. We promise, we promise.
Anybody's welcome.
Exactly. Also delighted to have with us, of course, Ambassador James Jones. Jim has supported us for many, many years, and we're delighted to always benefit from the wealth of experience and insight that you bring to the table. Our event today is relatively short. It's about 1 hour long. And so rather than go through bios, I think that we're probably just going to launch straight into the conversation, if that's okay with you. And we'd like to leave some time for you guys to ask questions as well. Armando Rios Piter is one of the most intriguing politicians in Mexico, if only for the fact that, of course...
That's a good way to present it.
I think it is.
Introduce
if only for the fact that, of course, he went to the university that I used to teach at, ITAM, and got a semi-neoliberal education there, and then came out and became somebody, a prominent figure on the left. And that's not always the case for folks who are educated at that kind of establishment in Mexico or around the world. But also you have defined your political career by establishing a distinct identity, I would say, in multiple ways. And for that reason, I think you are one of the most captivating figures today in Mexican politics. So we're delighted that you're here with us. And I'd like to just give you one sort of very general question to begin with, Senator, and that is, could you give us your thoughts on the current state of Mexican politics, the main issues on which you intend to run for the presidency in 2018? And perhaps you could dedicate a little bit of time there also to talk about what you see as the current state of the left in Mexico. The last time that we were together was actually in Mexico City at a little dinner we had organized with around 15 people from the left of the political spectrum in Mexico. And it was a fascinating conversation, and we heard a great diversity of views. So, Armando, I know it's a very general question, but I'd love for you to tell us your thoughts about where we are right now in the Mexican political universe.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all. Thank you to Atlantic Council. Thank you, Jason, very much. Thank you, Duncan and Woodrow Wilson, and of course, Ambassador James Jones. I have a presentation. I don't know if you want me to show it up. It has a few slides, sure. So probably I can make a point, and it has to do with the questions you have. Do we have the presentation? The PowerPoint here. Yeah, it'll be very fast. So, well, this is a clicker. So this will be this. Well, I think it's important, it's fair to say that Mexico right now at the moment is at a crossroads. And probably if you analyze it, analyze my country from one perspective, probably it is in the condition of failure, strict failure. Or probably it's in the condition of becoming a serious global, big global player. That's the position we are right now. Mexico is at a crossroads. Why? Just a few numbers. You'll have this presentation, but just let's say the number of missing people reached like 30,000 people between 2006 and 2016. 17 murders per every 10,000 persons. But there are cities like the state where I'm from, like the state of Guerrero, like Acapulco in the state of Guerrero, reaching 114 for every 100,000 people. And you have all these kind of figures. For instance, only 1% of the total crimes is solved in the country. So impunity and the lack of rule of law is an important figure that we must have in mind. But we also, and it's important to say it nowadays, where all this discussion regarding where is NAFTA going to, We have regions in the country, for instance, in Querétaro or in Aguascalientes, where all this automobile cluster has been developing for about 20 years. We are growing 8%. We have a very good integration with the U.S. economy. We have say we are the 7th world car producer. I think that figure is not fair enough right now. Some tell us it's the 4th biggest country in terms of building cars. 3.6 million cars a year. We have 113,000 engineers who graduate every year. That's probably even more engineers than those that Spain and France together are generating every year. So you see, there are two ways of seeing the country right now. Being in the States, after 100 days, I think it's important and fair enough to talk about the new administration, or to say just that this new speech, not only in the campaign, but this new position, this change of paradigm regarding the new administration in the U.S., I wouldn't see it as a threat. A lot of people see it like that. I see it as the biggest opportunity, probably in the new history of Mexico, of the new history of our Mexico-U.S. relationship. And if you change the perspective, the way all this talking, all this public discussion, all this new paradigm has evolved, I would like to see the wall, the famous, unfamous wall, not as a wall itself, but as a mirror. We right now have, because of Trump's position, the possibility of seeing each other to ourselves. Not only Mexico, but also the United States. And you can see all of the problems that we have regarding security, regarding trade, regarding migration, as a menace probably. Menace if we are trying to see how the diagnostic can have problems if we see only the other side. Trump has been doing that. He says all of the migrants who come here are a menace for us. Mexico is taking advantage of us because of NAFTA. Well, all this discussion, I think it's better to see it as a mirror. And as a Mexican, I want to see it as a mirror, as a big opportunity to see what Mexico is not doing well and what Mexico should change in order to have a better internal condition, but of course, a better relationship with the United States. But this needs, of course, to change the narrative. For instance, let's talk about drugs. I've been here probably for 4 days in the United States. I studied at Georgetown from 2000 to 2002. And it's the first time I've ever seen that the drugs problem here in the United States is in some different conversations than those I used to hear 17 years ago. Every time I would see that the drugs issue would be probably in the marginal places, in the marginal areas with the marginal demographics. But now, the issue of using opium, heroin, these kinds of drugs, which, by the way, are mostly generated in my home state, in the state of Guerrero, are becoming a major issue regarding white demographics, white people. Maryland, for instance, very close to here. So that's a problem of health, a health problem. And that takes us to the demand issue, to the problem of demand, to the problem of consumption. If we think not of a wall, but if we think of a mirror, then how can Mexico take a look at this? The common speech, the old-fashioned speech would say, then all the drug issue is a problem of the United States because they are having so much consumption. It's not fair to do that anymore. As I think it's not fair to say those bad guys, those bad hombres who are in there are sending us so many drugs that they are killing, hurting our people. We must see each of ourselves into the mirror. In the Mexican case, we must generate something that we have lacked, not for 1 year, not for one administration, but probably, and it's fair enough to say, for 200 years. A strong rule of law, a strong state that has justice in the middle of the way it behaves and in the way its community is functioning. So we need to change the narrative, as you see. And right now, saying this, where the next election is coming, not only that the paradigm between the US and Mexico because of Trump's administration is kind of shifting, kind of changing, we also have the election in the next year. So we must change the narrative, and I would say Mexico right now, at this crossroads, doesn't need a new messiah. Woman or man, I'm not meaning one specific messiah. If you have one in mind, one from the left, especially. We need a plan. We need to generate a better institutional way to do things. And we need a collective plan. A collective plan that has to do with three parts that right now are so important for becoming that serious global player that Mexico can become. We need to generate a better condition for harmony. We need to stop exclusion. And we need to stop the victim mentality. This is so important. In order to generate empathy, we need to stop the victim mentality that someone else is the cause for all our problems, but we need to see ourselves. Second, we need to start discussing how are we going to generate wealth. There's been so much discussion for the last 20, 30 years, probably 20 years, how we redistribute wealth. That's important, of course. Mexico is generating a lot of wealth. We are the 14th economy in the whole world. We have very important world players. We need to redistribute wealth. But it's important to think, how are we going to generate wealth? How is Mexican people, or how are Mexican people going to become rich people? First level income people regarding all the standards in the world. That's important to think. And there's only one way to do it. Let's look at the people. Let's look to the humans, to the men and women, to the children, as part of the most important capital for generating wealth. That's the only path. That has to do with education. That has to do with health. That has to do with putting all the resources in order to attain a goal. We have 120 million people. And if we sum up the 35 million people that are Mexicans, first, second, third generation, well, we're a very big country then, 155 million people. If we put in the middle, in the center of our model for growth, our people, then we'll be able to take advantage of the new age of growth, of the new economy, which is based on knowledge, technology, and, of course, people. And justice, which I would say is the most important part of the whole thing. I was telling you we have 200 years of not having a complete, integral, holistic justice model in my country. Why are we having so much drugs? Well, because we don't have an integral view way to see justice as the focal point, as the most important way to do things in the country. So justice, wealth, and harmony should be part of this new narrative. And right now, looking ourselves into the mirror, that's the best way to do business with the United States, with the new administration, and try to put this as the way to build a common relationship where the hemisphere, North American hemisphere, might become once again the most competitive area in the entire world. I like to see that way. In order of all of this, of course, we have a lot of problems to face, and the next election will be very important for us. We must kill the corruption and impunity dragon, and especially we must dry out the money of the elections. Why drying out the money of the elections? Because all the political parties right now, and I'm talking about the very big ones, I'm talking about the PRI, about the PAN, I'm talking about the PRD, and of the brand new Morena. Those are the big ones, no? Left, center, and right. All of them are having the same structural problem, which in my view, it is the seed of the corruption path we've of the corruption path we've had for the last 20 years, which has been evolved, but that right now it's what puts at stake the continuity and the functionality of Mexican state. That's why failure is a possibility. That's why all the figures I show you are happening right now. Killings, murderings, disappearances of people, clandestine graves. You have to deal with the political process. Campaigns, that's where the C of corruption is 6 C's. It was easy for me to do it in Spanish. It was complex for me to translate it, but I was able to do it, no? It has to do with political campaigns. That's where corruption starts. Why? Because parties need cash for votes, cash for buying votes. That generates clienteles, political clienteles. Who are the winners and who are the losers? Who are the ones who get all the programs and the closeness to the government and who do not? The clienteles are part of this. Of course, in the middle, the compadres. Los compadres para los cuates. After that, those compadres are important because they are the ones who give the money. They are the ones who finance the campaigns. Public money is being used for the campaigns, but for every peso, that's a figure that Luis Carlos Ugalde did in Integralia recently, for every public peso you have in a Mexican campaign, you will have another 5 private pesos. Some of them licit, but most of them illicit. Probably some of those monies come from organized crime, come from drug cartels, or come from the people who are attacking the people, taking taxes instead of the government. So these compadres finance the campaigns, and then they get contracts for building a bridge, for selling the medicines to the government, or probably for installing crime, for crime to occur in places such as is happened in my home state, in Iguala, in Guerrero, where on the 26th of September 2014, 43 kids were kidnapped, students from Ayotzinapa, and they disappeared. It was important. It was terrible, horrific situation. The whole world knew and saw how this chain is working in Iguala. Just a figure for you. Right now, we are currently running 4 state elections: the state of Mexico, Veracruz, the state of Coahuila, and Nayarit. In those 4 states, we are going to be spending this year, only in this year, $1.5 billion. So that's a huge amount of money. That's the same amount of money we are spending in science and technology as a country. So this is a very ridiculous, stupid, nonsense figure. How to change this? I'm finishing. Well, this is just an example of how everyone is in the same thing. That's a photo from the Partido Acción Nacional. I don't know how you say it in English, but it's a very important brand in Mexico. It's Rotoplas, no? It's a tinaco for putting water, no? Partido Acción Nacional in Puebla, Morena in Estado de México, PRI in Estado de México, and the Distrito Federal, city of Mexico City, regarding how giving things. Actually, the figure is, I have photos of every party giving tinacos everywhere, giving rotoplaces. So political parties cannot change, cannot give us this new narrative, cannot go against corruption because of this kind of drug that money has become regarding campaigns. So what do we need to do? We need to do a movement regarding inspiration, independent movement that thus generates a very low-cost campaign. Everybody will say that's nonsense. Everybody will say, you're crazy. We went to see a crazy senator. He wants to win with a little amount of money. This is what's generating right now 90% of rejection to the political parties, this thing. So that's the narrative. That's where the election should go. It doesn't even matter who wins. That's a problem. If you want to solve the corruption in order to get the new narrative, that's the thing you need to change. So I will close. I think actions do matter. We need people who can say no to power itself in this path, in this way of doing politics, in order to uphold the principle. 2 years ago, because of the 43 kids being kidnapped, even though I was the front runner for being a governor, what in Mexico means a lot, is becoming one of the gatekeepers of the system. I had 67% of all the polls saying that I will be a governor. After the killing of the kids, the disappearance, I rejected to be a candidate. I said I wouldn't continue doing politics in that way because that's what generating harm, that's what generating violence, and that's what generating the path for failure of Mexico. We need to change that. And thank you very much, Duncan Wood.
Good job. Good job.
Thank you so much, Senator. And it was shortly after you made that decision that actually you came here to the Wilson Center last time, and we talked about the future of the left in Mexico. And it was fascinating at that point in time to hear your thoughts on where the left in Mexico was going. There are so many issues here that are obviously of critical importance to the future of Mexico, but also, I would say, for the bilateral relationship. Ambassador Jones, you heard the senator talk about how this is an opportunity. This moment in time is an opportunity for Mexico. Some people have also begun to say that, in fact, this moment in time, tricky time in bilateral affairs, a few of the most complicated, difficult months in the history of the bilateral relationship, at least in recent history, that maybe there's a silver lining in that as well for all of us. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is that friends that we didn't know we had for the bilateral relationship have begun to come out and to talk about the bilateral relationship. Friends who didn't even know that they were friends of the bilateral relationship have realized it. For example, corn farmers, pork farmers in places like Iowa. That's been a remarkable revelation. I wonder if I could turn to you and say, you know, the senator has talked about the coming election, the need to change the narrative. How do you see the importance of that election, what's happening in bilateral relations right now for the future of this relationship?
Well, I believe that elections are very important. My name was on the ballot in 8 different elections, and you read what the people really want you to do when you go into office if you win from those elections, even though it doesn't necessarily come out clear to everybody. But politicians read that. So I think the elections both in the U.S. Congress in 2018 and especially in Mexico with the presidential elections are very important to this bilateral relationship. And I would say, regardless of the insults that have been hurled Mexico's way now, the current bilateral relationship is still strong. Part of that is because there are so many family connections between Mexico and the United States. There are commercial relationships that creates wealth, and wealth that's worth defending, and all of those things point out to the fact that we do have good bilateral relationships. However, those could be changed. I think that a lot of it depends on the United States and on where this current president, President Trump, comes down in the relationship with Mexico. I guess it's frustrating to me. When I was head of the American Stock Exchange in New York, I had to deal with the floor traders. Very much, it was a whole collection of Donald Trumps, basically, which long-range planning and strategic planning was about 15 to 30 minutes, as opposed to a few years down the road, and where the mind changes rapidly as to where you really want to go. And that was very frustrating. I did not think I'd ever see this as the leader of our country, this kind of attitude. But I do have hope that every president, my first job was with President Johnson. Every president wants to be remembered kindly by history. And that is as they get into the job, that's their motivating force. And I hope that President Trump, who is not exactly a great student of history, but will become one over the next few years, will understand the relationship with Mexico, and will sort of keep his powder dry as far as the elections in 2018. If that doesn't happen, I'm very concerned, because politicians also respond to their public, to their constituents. If the United States, through our government, would continue to throw insults Mexico's way, that could stir up the populace of Mexico, to which the politicians would have to respond, and particularly some of them on the left or on the right. And that could determine what our bilateral relationship is after 2018. Having said all that, I'm an optimist. I think the relationships have become so strong and so intertwined over the last 2.5 decades, primarily because of the success of NAFTA in both countries. I think that cooler heads and a sense of responsibility will prevail. So I'm optimistic. We're going through a rough patch now, but I think we'll get through it.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I actually share your optimism, and I'm often labeled a Boy Scout. Thank God I don't wear the uniform anymore, because that was weird for a while. You know, I see this as very much, there's a learning process underway. I mean, coming into the presidency, and many presidents have experienced this, it's learning how to deal with Congress, for a start, is learning how to deal with a political environment, is learning how to deal with other countries. Dealing with a sovereign country is very different than dealing with a business partner or a business counterpart or a contractor. And I actually see that there is definite progress in this. So I'm relatively optimistic in the long term. Jason, let me turn to you, and you heard what Senator Rios Piter said about the trends that he thinks are most important in Mexican politics at this point in time. You know, there was a lot of reference, obviously, to corruption and to campaign financing, and many people have said that here in the United States we just renamed corruption campaign financing. I mean, that it's a different way of doing things, of getting your issues onto the agenda. How do you see the broader trends right now in Mexican politics, and your evaluation of the prospects for 2018?
Well, first off, Duncan, thanks for hosting us, and great to do this event together. Senator Rios Piter, great to share the stage with you, and Ambassador Jones, Jim, this is great. And Duncan, I actually never made it to be a Boy Scout. I was only a Cub Scout, but I still share the optimism that you have. And I think that one of the reasons, before going to question, one of I think the important points, Senator, that you have in your presentation is, you know, the 113,000 engineering graduates that are coming out of Mexico, more than I think France and Germany that you had in your presentation. I think that's a story that isn't oftentimes told, right? And I think that in the context that we're in right now, where so much of the agenda tends to be dominated by the politics of the bad hombres or the migrants or the drugs. I mean, looking at Mexico as an opportunity is, I think, the way that we should be looking at Mexico. And I share not just because I was a Cub Scout, but I share the optimism on the panel. Just yesterday, Secretary Kelly announced that they're going to be hosting an event in mid-June down in Miami to look at opportunities for prosperity in Central America. And who is it being co-hosted with? It's being co-hosted with the Mexicans. Secretary Tillerson and Kelly had discussed this when they were down in Mexico. I guess that was about a month or so ago. And so that kind of thing gives me reason for optimism that despite the rhetoric that we're seeing subsided over Twitter, but that the integral working relationship continues, because the U.S. and Mexico have so many shared interests that extend very deep into our relationship. How do I see Mexico 2018 broader politics? Senator, you mentioned the upcoming elections on June 4th in Coahuila, state of Mexico, Manatt is among others, and I think those are really help us to start to see. I mean, this is kind of the beginning of the beginning of the political season, looking at the campaign in 2018, and you know, interesting to see. I mean, especially in the state of Mexico, where that election ends up coming down the end, because it's so close between Morena and between the PRI. I think that'll give an indication of where the voters are going. But, we're still 13 months away from the election. We still have the parties. We won't know their official candidates until early 2018. We know some of the candidates that are not affiliated with parties. But I think a lot can change, as we know, between now and then. And some of the polling that we've seen thus far among the parties, we don't know who the candidates are going to be. And you have such a high number of undecided voters. I think it's about a quarter of voters that are undecided when they even look. But I think at the parties, one of the things to take into account, we were talking about this before, is is there going to be yes, there will be a U.S. role in the election, what happens with NAFTA and whatnot, but will there be a U.S. role insofar as President Trump deciding to send out tweets in favor of or against a certain candidate, as he has done and shown a proclivity for doing with other elections just in his first few months? And if that happens, that will have a significant influence, I think, on the election, far beyond the issues that are being worked out at a technical level. And I think insofar as the modernization, the renegotiation, whatever you want to call it, of NAFTA, the stage in which that's in when we come to election season in Mexico, I think will bear big implications on the results of the election too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I know that everybody at this table believes firmly in dialogue, so I'd like to encourage you now, if you have a question for our panel, please raise your hand. It's always difficult to be the first one, but we have some brave souls. One here in the middle, one over here on the right, and somebody back there in the middle. So if we can get the microphone down here in front first of all, please. Thank you, gentleman in the purple spotted tie, which is rather splendid. I think we need to switch it on, yes. Yeah, now it's on. Yeah.
Hi, Gugaratsu for Argus Media. Mr. Senator, one of the big events in Mexico in the last 5-6 years was the energy sector reform, and I was wondering what your assessment of it is, and what would you do differently if elected?
Thank you. Next question back here. We'll take 3 if that's okay. Right here, yes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I'm Isabel Hoagland from Inside U.S. Trade. I'm wondering, what kind of support is there for dumping the U.S. as a market, specifically for corn? And then my second question is, talks for renegotiation of sugar suspension agreements between the U.S. and Mexico appear to have stalled recently. And Commerce has said it will impose duties starting June 5th if no agreement is found. How do you see these sugar talks in the broader NAFTA context? Are they setting the stage for the negotiating atmosphere between the countries?
Calling on your economics background here, Senator. Okay, there we go. And there was one here, yes, the lady with the pink shirt.
Hi, my name's Mariana. I'm part of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs in the Washington Center. My question is, given that there is multiple independent candidates looking to run for the 2018 presidential election, how can these independent candidates unite their ideas and bases and build a coalition to face the establishment political parties?
Thank you very much. 3 excellent questions. I would like to add in, so that we can incorporate our 2 other panelists, I'd like to get your reflections on the reform. The energy reform was mentioned there, and obviously implicit in a lot of this conversation, in particular due to the Senator's comments on generating wealth in Mexico. That the reform agenda of 2013-2014 has had an impact on Mexico, but it hasn't had the big impact. We haven't seen that wave of growth coming through just yet. What are the reforms that you guys see are still pending in Mexico? And obviously, feel free to answer that one as well, Senator. And I'd just like to add in another one, which is, how do we balance the question of a more equitable society with that of a more prosperous, competitive Mexico?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. The first one regarding the energy sector. Well, let's say that energy reform, in my view, came very late for Mexico. I mean, we didn't, if we had done it before, probably the benefits of that energy reform would have been better. They say that it was 20 years after the discussion should have taken place. My concerns regarding that reform, that's why I voted against it, no, were most of them were regarding how strong would Mexican state be in my opinion, the regulation conditions are still weak, should be stronger because you have these very big global players. So you should have a stronger state in order for corruption or lack of transparency or lack of accountability wouldn't be the mainstream of how the conditions of the energy sector would evolve. I think there's needs something to be taken care of that. But saying this, it's more important to push it forward to strengthen the reform than having uncertainty around it. There are people right now in Mexico, let's say the PRI or the PAN, that say that this is the panacea, that this is the best thing that ever happened, and they don't have this critic position regarding how we should be looking forward for the energy reform. There are other actors, such as Morena and Andrés Manuel, which are saying we're going to go to a public referendum, probably in the Zócalo, to say, what do you guys want regarding this reform? Just think about the uncertainty about it. I mean, it's good for saying in a demagogic way, but it's not the way to think clear about what should be done as a plan for generating wealth and for generating investment, and of course, better conditions for the people. If you strengthen the state as a way to regulate these activities, then you have a strong population taking care about this sector. That's not in the table right now. And some, I think, I don't agree with these positions which come from one part of the left saying, let's go to a public referendum regarding it. I don't buy that. Let's look forward. For instance, nobody is discussing how the economy and the technology will change for the next 10 years regarding solar energy, regarding how we are going to have Tesla cars not costing $350,000, but probably $10,000. So that's a huge change. And that's why you must be thinking right now regarding energy or any other sector, how do you grab the future? How do you grab technology? How do you grab decisions that generate certainty and, of course, investment and benefits for the population? I want to put it together with the issue of education. There have been a lot of reforms, no? Mm-hmm. Some of them that weren't articulated in the best way. The education reform, no? Which is, by the way, the one that is loved the most. All of these reforms have a lot of attacks because they haven't delivered them well. They have a lot of problems. They didn't design them with the people, especially the education one with the teachers, and that was a huge mistake, no? But you have this way, I'm talking about the education reform, you have this way to think about a more organized education system. Nobody thought of that reform, education reform, of being a platform coordinated with the telecommunications reform, or the telecommunications reform done together or coordinated with the finance reform. Everything is so intertwined that you should continue that path in order to get more benefits. And that needs to be done with the people, not in a referendum issue. You must talk with that, and you must hear the people in order to keep on knowing what is the path. Talk with the teachers. Do politics, not only enhancing these kind of reforms top-down. That would be my point regarding what should be done for productivity and competitiveness. The issue of corn, I have so many questions regarding corn. No? I put this bill, and some places they saw me like, oh, this is the demon that wants to destroy NAFTA. No, he's pouring fresh blood. No, I remember Rambo saying that. No, yeah, remember that movie? I just remember it right now.
Great image in my head.
Yeah, the issue is not pouring first blood. I don't believe in a trade war, and not with the United States. I think NAFTA has evolved well. It has done pretty good for some areas, and there are very important areas that need to evolve. I just had this bill with Senator Sanders in here, Bernie Sanders, regarding raising wages, not walls, as the campaign. No? I think right now that we have 20 years after NAFTA, we must think together about how the evolution should come. Well, of course, given certainty that we have lost because of the speech of the new president of the United States, and then blood needs to stop. Let's stop bleeding, I was saying in a meeting yesterday. So we must give certainty, which is one of the pillars of the trade. My bill had to do with giving information to the people who were supporting that anti-Mexican speech. position. Who are the ones who were supporting the most Trump's position? Ironically, those guys in the heartland, in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin. Those guys who win from doing trade with my country, 1,600 million, 100,600. I always have this problem with the billions and the millions, but huge quantities of dollars going to American pockets, heartland American pockets, because of selling corn for more than 20 years. That's important. For 20 years doing business, certainty, generating wellness in both sides of the border, they needed to know that Mexico is not a punching bag. They needed to know that this trade that can evolve must be treated in a fair way, and that somebody needs in my country to stand up and say that. Of course, just put this figure in your mind. We depend 100% for this corn for our cattle to grow. That's a matter of food security. And here's my teacher, food security. She's here. Joanna, thank you for coming. I didn't know you were going to come. Thank you very much. So the issue of food security is important. What about if they stop selling it to us? It's not that we stop buying. They stop selling it to us. What would be the impact for Mexican people, for their food? It would be a huge impact. So then you must diversify, and it makes sense to diversify. And in that same day, in that same year, I take notice that for this specific year, Brazil is selling every ton $10 lower, put in Veracruz, shipped. Well, so it makes political sense for people here in the States to know that we must be treating each other with dignity in a fair way to evolve our relationship. It makes sense economically, at least for this year. And we must see, once again, our rural areas in Mexico as areas for generating more income. Otherwise, we will keep on sending people here, and immigration will keep on being a matter of fear, especially in those areas where people don't know, have not ever had to deal with brown skinned people. It's a matter of fear. Well, it makes sense to do this thing, I think. Probably that's the way we must see sugar. If this horrendous, that I don't think is a good path, trade war continues. I think that the decision of last week was a turning point. I hope to see it. And I wasn't a young, what do you call it, the Boy Scout.
Boy Scout.
No? Should have been. No? The issue, I think, is that can be a turning point. Why? Because we saw all these actors. What I heard yesterday at the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is that these producers didn't know that they were selling their corn to Mexico, because they sell it to an intermediary, and the intermediary is the one to put it in the ground. Well, it was very good then to put the bill in. Now there's more information. And after 100 years of days, hopefully not 100 days of this administration, now this information is facing the reality, which was the main point of my bill. I didn't want President Trump to know about that. I wanted the senator of Iowa to know it. He was the first one who responded it. He said, "Who's this Rios Piter that's talking about corn?" Well, then you have the Hill. And then you have a whole different way of doing things. And I think that's the path where you can build alliances, where you have people who know how important our relationship is, and where you can build common sense in order to think together to make things better, not to destroy each other. And my final position, of course, that's a big menace, having a lot of independent candidates. Even the system might put different candidates, one from the left, one from the right, just to play around and say, Rios Piter, he's part of the mafia del poder, or he's the guy from the left who tries to destroy the right and certainty. Well, of course, that's a menace. But there's also the opportunity of dialoguing with different people who have good skills, who know that the current path of Mexico shouldn't continue, and making politics and united because of convincing each other that it's not the matter of the personality of one single candidate, but that it is an idea and a path to do things collectively in a different way, because the problem is how the parties are working right now. I love political parties in terms of saying that they are so important for democracy. But the worst thing that you can ever have is having parties, political parties, like the ones we right now in Mexico. So if they are, let's say, like drug users, no, drug addicts, and the drug is the money, let's take them to rehab. That's what I'm going to do. And that makes the possibility of uniting every single candidate from the independent side and making a movement, a collective movement regarding a plan. Our movement is called WAVE 365, Ola 365. 300 single independent candidates for being representatives to Congress, 64 single candidates for being senators, and 1 single candidate for being president. That's the way to do a new platform and to get wealth, harmony, and justice as the new path for Mexico.
Thank you, Senator. Ambassador.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the reforms of the last few years have been most impressive. Just as Social Security is the third rail of U.S. politics, oil was the third rail of Mexican politics, and it did not become a political reality, a possibility, until this last decade. And the fact that Mexico's government took it on was very impressive. I would say, as far as the reforms are concerned, I would suggest less that they left out reforms and more that they need to concentrate on implementing the reforms they have and building the institutions. I think that's particularly true on the judicial, the legal reforms that were made. That is fundamental to any democratic society, that the entire population, citizens, feel they have a fair shake at getting justice. And the problem with the judicial reforms of 2008 that were supposed to be fully implemented, I think, by last year, were impressive. The fact is that it so fundamentally changed a legal system that those who are implementing the new reforms don't know how to do it. And so there's a big gap there. So implementation of the judicial reforms are particularly important. The other big issue I think that has to be dealt with is the gap in income, gap in wealth. And that's really two Mexicos, the North primarily and the South primarily. And there are no quick fixes for that. In my judgment, we ran into that in the area where I grew up in the United States after the Great Depression, where there was big gaps in income and in wealth and in opportunity. The way you cure those things is through education, through healthcare, and through infrastructure. If you make a product, you make it efficiently, you have to get it to market. And that's a long-term deal. So I think that's what they need to concentrate on. I have great confidence in the Mexican government. And also, let me say, the Mexican government and the political parties and participants, such as the senator, have been very mature in responding to the situation that we find ourselves today. And I hope that maturity will be able to continue, because I think it's terribly important to our bilateral relationship. And finally, let me also just thank the Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute, and the Atlantic Council for co-sponsoring this, and for Senator making your very fine presentation. I don't disagree with anything that's been said by Jason or the Senator or Duncan, and I think if we can all spread this message beyond our closed circle, that's really important, because I'm astounded at how many Americans and Americans in official capacity do not know Mexico, do not understand Mexico. And until we get that knowledge and that understanding and that relationship going, I think we're always going to have some problems.
Thank you, Ambassador. Jason.
I think, Jim, just on that point, I mean, this is the folks like us can look at this really as an opportunity, a real opportunity. I think, Senator, as you were saying, that the number of people who aren't even aware that their jobs depend on NAFTA, and whether it's trade jobs, whether it's investment jobs, I'll give a shout out to Chris and Duncan, the great work that you all have done here on calculating the number of jobs that are dependent on U.S. Mexico. But it's a matter of getting that word out further to people across the heartland, and the number of Mexican, not just jobs that depend on trade, but jobs that depend on Mexican investment in the United States. Small towns all across the United States whose populations depend on Mexico investments. It's a narrative that I think all of us working together, friends of Mexico, can help to get out through a variety of different channels. Jim, I agree with you on the reforms. I think especially the judicial reform is very difficult to implement, and part of the reason is because it requires a whole new level of education, right? A level of education of judges, of prosecutors, of lawyers, of how to work in that new system of moving from written to oral trials and what that fundamentally means, and that takes some time, but it's so fundamental to the rule of law in Mexico. I would add something else, though. I would add out, and Senator, going back to your presentation, corruption, and that there has been some movement from President Peña Nieto to try to put forward commissions and whatnot to deal with stamping out corruption. I think the efforts have come, it's seen by many in Mexico, too little, too late. And that what's really necessary, and I know there's discussion of that in the extraordinary session that Congress will have of a law with regard to public functionaries, to public officials, insofar as stamping out incentives for corruption and having stronger legislation in that regard. And I think that that's really important, not just for the officials themselves, but really for legitimizing the system. I think that we're at a point, because going back to Iguala and what that meant, and that was I think a watershed moment, unfortunately, for President Peña Nieto and for his agenda, but it really, I think, solidified the mistrust that people have in the political class, and that corruption is important, not just for rejuvenating the political class, but also for having the trust that people that's so necessary to move forward. And I think, Duncan, on your question of how do you create a more equitable society that's also competitive, I think that's precisely what we need to be doing, right? And I think that there's the question that goes back to finding ways to move from having two Mexicos, where you have the haves and the have-nots, to having one Mexico, just like in this country where we have, I think, multiple United States, where the way that the workforce, the way that technology is going to be rapidly advancing and rapidly changing the fundamental nature of work, the fundamental nature of economies, we need to, whether it's here, whether it's in Mexico, thinking through how do we capture that, and capture that in a way that doesn't put certain people out to dry, but ensures that holistically people are able to take advantage of that. Mexico, and Guadalajara is an innovation hub, for example, and so how do we capture what's happening in Guadalajara and move that more broadly all across the Mexican state? I see we're out of time, but just Duncan, a thanks to you, Chris, and the Mexico Institute and Woodrow Wilson for co-hosting this with us.
Thank
Fun
you,
as
Jason.
always.
Thanks so very much. I've got a number of takeaways here from this, which are terrific, to do with regulation, the changes that are coming in energy. I'd like to point out that on the question of rule of law and political change in Mexico, we're about to release 2 books in the next couple of months. One by Luis Rubio, where he talks about the opportunity for Mexico, political reforms that are needed, and another that's edited by myself and Viri Rios, looking at suggestions for improving the rule of law in Mexico. I mean, it's a collection of short pieces looking at concrete examples of where we could, for example, increase police accountability and professionalism, things like that. But perhaps my favorite takeaway from today is your comment, or your soundbite, Senator. Let's take political parties to rehab. I like that. I think that your theme music for the campaign should be Amy Winehouse, clearly. I'd like to see another video on YouTube of you maybe dancing to that one. That would be a terrific one. I think they tried to make me go to rehab. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our excellent panel.
Thank you very much. Are you recruiting all these independent candidates? That's part of our job. We're looking all over the place.